So we left off talking about our homunculi, these maps of the voluntary motor control that you exert coming from the precentral gyrus, and then your somatosensory information that comes in on the postcentral gyrus. This is a representation of what it would look like if our body corresponded to how much territory it gets in the brain. So, information traveling around your brain. How is it getting from one place to another? Why do we care about action potentials in the nervous system? Well, because this is how information is getting anywhere. This is how the brain is communicating. And so we've got these tracts of neurons that run from one brain region to another. These guys right here are called arcuate fibers, and arcuate fibers are just connecting like very, very close in space in this outer gray matter. So let's say you feel a burn on your hand, and that is being processed in your postcentral gyrus. You need to be able to quickly execute a motor command in your precentral gyrus to move away from that. So the sensory information is going to come up and be processed in your somatosensory cortex, and then if you've got to initiate a motor command to get away from it, then we don't want to have to communicate a very far space, so you just hop that central sulcus in one of these arcuate fibers, and you can initiate your motor command to move away. So arcuate fibers are just attaching little, like smaller sections in the cortex. The next type of fibers that we see are called longitudinal fasciculi. Fasciculi is the plural for fascicles. Fascicles, we said, were bundles of neurons that are running together. And so this is how you're communicating information between lobes, so across long distances in the brain. This corpus callosum here also contains a bunch of neurons that are communicating, but they're communicating between hemispheres. So these tracts are called commissural tracts that are running through the corpus callosum. And then the last kinds of tracts that we'll find are called projection tracts. And these are going from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord, and then also you have neurons running from the spinal cord up. And what you can see is that we've got decussation, which is the crossing over that happens in what are called the medullary pyramids. So we'll talk about the medulla oblongata in a little bit. But we said that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. So some of that crossing over is happening at the level of the spine. We'll talk about that when we get to spinal conduction pathways. But some pathways, the decussation is happening here in the medulla. So these projection tracts are how we're getting from the cerebral cortex down to the spine and back. Alright, so if we look at functional areas, we can look at the areas of the brain that are serving motor functions and the areas of the brain that are serving sensory functions. So for our motor functions, we've got the primary motor cortex, which is that precentral gyrus we talked about. So all of your voluntary motor commands arise in the precentral gyrus. The next motor area that we need to be aware of is this place called Broca's area. We'll look at it on a picture in just a minute. This area is involved with all of the motor commands that are associated with speech. And this is lateralized at 90% of the population, and 90% of the population is found on the left side of the brain. Then we also have an area called the Frontal Eye Field that's in control of voluntary eye movements. Alright, so if we look at the brain then, we've got our left and right hemispheres. Our motor control is all arising in this precentral gyrus. So all of our voluntary motor commands come from the precentral gyrus. Our right hand motor control is coming from the left side of our brain. Our left hand is coming from the right side of our brain. So just remember that. Broca's area, found on the left side of the brain for 90% of the population. Frontal eye field is going to help to organize your voluntary eye movements. The visual field is pretty interesting. The sense of vision is pretty crazy. We'll talk more about that at the end of the semester. Before we talk about this, yeah.
For the 10% that the Broca's is on the right side, does it do anything to the speech? Like,
No, they just have different lateralization. So 90% of the population, their brains will specialize this way, lateralize this way.
Oh.
It's 10%. It's more like 5 or 6% that are flipped and specialize the other way, and then the other 4% they don't have any lateralization. So it's most people. This is the map of the brain and the way it works.
Okay.
All right. So before we go on to our sensory areas, I just want to kind of talk about the difference between general senses and special senses because we have to. Because I think now if I ever teach this class again, I'll do it backwards. I'll start with senses because that's what most people are familiar with. You can feel stuff. You don't really think about this glob of tissue hanging out in your head. But our general senses are all of those that are going to be laid out on that primary somatosensory cortex. So these are things like touch, which is felt as pressure. So we feel this pressure as light pressure or deep pressure. We can also feel vibration or temperature or pain. So these are all generalized and they'll all wind up being processed in whichever part of the somatosensory homunculus is responsible for responding to that part of the body. Our special senses are special. They require special sensory receptors and, or in the case of the eyes, whole organs that are going to be special, and then they're processed in specific lobes of the brain. So our special senses are vision, olfaction, which is smelling, audition, which is hearing, gustation, which is tasting. So these are our special senses, and we'll spend a good deal of time talking about each of these senses on their own at the end of the semester, and talk about how it is that their receptors work and get the information to their specific lobe of the brain. So if we look at our sensory areas, for the functional areas that are processing sensory information, the primary somatosensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus, and this is what's responding to our general senses. Our primary visual cortex is in the occipital lobes. Our primary auditory cortex is in the temporal lobes.
Is this kind of all that you're going to require us to know of these? Okay.
For now, when we get to the next test, you're going to have to know sensory pathways in great detail.
Okay.
But for the brain, you do have to be aware of brain functions, because that's where it's all going to. The primary olfactory cortex is also in the temporal lobes. And then our primary gustatory cortex, which is for our sense of taste, is this region called the insula, which is deep to the temporal lobes, and it's not really easy to see on any of our models, so I'm not likely to have some part labeled and ask you to identify insula, but I could ask you to tell me the part of the brain that's responsible for processing all of this different type of information. So if I said, what part is responsible for processing information for taste, you would have to know it's the insula. Alright, so again, for our sensory areas, our general senses are coming in on this posterior or the post-central gyrus. And the right side of our brain is responding to sensory information from the left side of the body. Left side of the brain responding to information from the right side of the body. Our occipital lobes, we can see in this image, this is our primary visual cortex. You can't see the temporal lobes in that image, but that's where we have our audition and olfaction. Now the next region of the brain that we need to talk about is the diencephalon. So the diencephalon, it has three parts, and this model we can see the diencephalon really nicely here in orange. And the three parts, the first part, there are two parts to the epithalamus, but the most important part for our purposes, or really, I mean, until you get into like deep neurophysiology someday, which you may never get to, the part that we care about the epithalamus is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is this region toward the posterior aspect of the diencephalon. It's this little knobby guy sticking off the back here. And what is important for is regulating our circadian rhythms or sleep-wake cycles. It actually responds to the sun going down and starts producing melatonin, which gets you ready for sleep. So this is important for melatonin production. It resets your clock every day, so everybody has a normal melatonin rhythm that without light input would just reset on its own at around 24 hours. We call this the circadian rhythm. So circa means around, dien, a day, so it's your normal daily rhythm, and the rhythm for melatonin is either shorter than 24 hours, those people tend to be early risers, or longer than 24 hours, those people tend to be night people. But basically what happens is that as the sun's going down, melatonin production will start to increase and you'll start getting tired. It gets you ready for bed. People who are blind can still get input to the pineal gland. There are some types of being blind that totally obliterate all connections. But most people who are blind can still get input about light information through this lower optic tract that brings information back to the pineal gland, so they can reset every day. So that's the part of the epithalamus that we care about. The pineal gland sits back here. You'll talk about it more next semester when you get to the endocrine system. So epi means upon, the thalamus, so this is the thalamus, this big region in here, it's kind of spanning out to here. We'll see a picture of the thalamus that shows it in more detail in a minute, but from the side view it's this region that you see here. This is also part of it, out here. So it's big, and our thalamus is our sensory relay station. So almost all of your sensory information is going to come and synapse onto the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to send off neurons that take it to where it goes for processing. So this is our sensory relay station. Information comes up your spinal cord, then goes to your thalamus, and then it ships it off to the right part of the somatosensory cortex. And then hypothalamus is this region below the thalamus. So it really looks insignificant on these models. It's just this orange triangle right here. But the hypothalamus is so important. This is the master controller of your autonomic nervous system. Your autonomic nervous system is the nervous system you're not thinking about. So the part that's dealing with like changes in blood pressure or is sensing stretch in your abdominal organs. So it's the master controller of the autonomic nervous system, which is also abbreviated ANS. We'll talk about this more at the end of the semester as well. It's also, the hypothalamus is really important because it's the master controller of the endocrine system. you should start 202 with the endocrine system. So it's very important that you're aware of the hypothalamus, where it is and what it does. So it's regulating control over your pituitary gland, which is considered the master gland. So a lot of people think of the nervous system as being your only controller. It's not. It's your fast controller. It's the one that we can feel the effects of immediately. But we have two control systems. The endocrine system is another control system. It just controls longer term variables like feeding and reproduction, things like that. So not these real quick things, but longer term homeostatic variables. And that's where you'll begin next semester. Other things the hypothalamus does is it's the control center for our body temperature. So it controls our body temperature. It is the part of your brain that's responsive to hunger and thirst. So it'll help you control your food and water intake. And then it can work with the pineal gland to help with regulating your sleep-wake cycle. Alright, so let's look at some pictures. Everything in purple here is the diencephalon, the pineal gland sitting back here making our melatonin, the thalamus in here being the sensory relay station, and then the hypothalamus down here really looks insignificant, but it's so important. This is a better picture of the thalamus showing. So the hypothalamus is this group, clusters of nuclei. Depending on who your teacher is, you might have to know the individual nuclei that are responsible for different releasing hormones. I don't make my students worry about the individual nuclei, but you do have to know about the hormones that are coming from here because it's the master controller of the endocrine system. This is where you start next semester. And the endocrine system should carry you through all of the other systems because just like the nervous system, it's a controller. So it's got some effect in all of the other systems. So the hypothalamus sits here and it has these different clusters of cell bodies, that's what nuclei are, that are projecting their axons down and affecting the pituitary gland. So you'll start, this is the master gland, this is the master controller of that gland. So ultimately the hypothalamus is going to be our main control center for our endocrine system. So you'll talk about that more next semester. And if we move down the brain, away from the diencephalon, the next part that we get to is the brainstem. The brainstem has three regions. The superficial-most region is called the midbrain. It's not easy to see from the front of these models, but you can see it here kind of on the back of these models. This is the midbrain back here, and the midbrain is going to be important for controlling all of your reflexive movements in response to visual and auditory stimuli. So if something goes flying past your head and you turn your head to track it, that's coming from the midbrain. So this controls your reflexive behavior. So we'll say reflexive movements in response to visual and auditory stimuli.